and that's a good thing. The operating standards are still in the works. Once those operating standards do get changed, that's when we'll see changes to the forms and the processes and procedures we use. So until we get the changes in the operating standards, it's business as usual, which is good news for us. Everybody in our region is doing a pretty darn good job of completing the ETR process. Typically, when OEC goes out and monitors, we'll get a list of things that need to have corrections or attention paid to when it comes to training. And typically in our region, the ETRs are in pretty good shape. There are a couple sticking points that we're going to talk about as we move through the presentation today, but generally, overall, they look pretty good. And that's good news for all of you as well. When we do these presentations, we usually offer two disclaimers right up front. The first of those disclaimers is what we're going to talk about today is what we know to be correct today. That's disclaimer one. Disclaimer two is everything's subject to change tomorrow. And you guys know that. Fortunately, we have not had many changes over the past few years, but like I said, once those operating standards come out, we will see changes, and sometimes those changes do happen a little abruptly. So don't be surprised. Special ed is always changing. The feds are always updating their rules and regulations, and we're always getting changes throughout the year. That's why one of the main reasons we offer our COSE sessions at the Central Ohio Special Education Administrators Group. We use that format to convey new information out into the field, provide updates, and do that. So if you're not involved with the COSE organization, we suggest you look on STARS and check out when we have those meetings as well. I'm going to add a third disclaimer today. And that's because of some of the uncertainty that ODE and we have, and you have, surrounding certain questions regarding processes and procedures related to special ed. We do not address every single circumstance that can occur, and there are certain things that districts and community schools can do a little differently. Just as an example, in IEPs, for example, some districts and community schools will want the disability category that's listed on the ETR for the student to be included in the background information. And other districts and schools don't want that. So that's a circumstance where if we say something and it doesn't sound quite right, you need to go to your supervisor and clarify, how do we do that here? So just keep that in mind. We're going to talk about generalities today, not the specifics that may apply to your district or school. The other thing that may come up is you may get into a situation where you want to consult with your attorney and ask him or her how you should address things in your district or school. And there again, there are certain, we have a situation with one community school right now where EMIS categories are being discussed, and their attorney is actually involved in that process because of the potential consequences of coding kids wrong or incorrectly. So anyhow, if there are things that your special ed supervisors are not certain about, you may want to consult with your attorney. Okay. And that's my list of things before we jump into the PowerPoint. Any questions thus far? Okay, well, let me do this. And I'm going to start my screen share. Okay, can you guys see that title screen okay? Yep. I can't see you anymore. I'm looking at my screen. I can't see. So verbally we're good to go there?
You're good.
Hey, okay,
real quick.
Okay, Greg, on this title page here, on the cover page, we have a link on here that will take you to all the resources that SST-11 provides to help you with your ETR and IEP processes. We have one for ETR and one for IEP. In looking at this bit.ly site, it may or may not work for you. We are merging files from one system onto another right now. And yesterday this worked. And last night when I double checked it on my computer, it was acting kind of wonky. So if you try that and it doesn't act correctly, give us a couple days and we'll get that figured out and get it straightened out for you. So don't be alarmed if that particular link doesn't work. It's because of our movement of files from one system to another at the SST right now. The other thing, before we jump right in here, OEC asked us 2 years ago to always mention upfront waivers, using waivers for the ETR process. In the operating standards, there is a provision that will allow you as a team with the parent consent to actually waive and not do a reevaluation for a student. And some folks do that, but what we want to do is caution you about using that process in a very limited manner and being very cautious with it. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, we had a district that we were asked to provide technical assistance to, and we looked at some of the ETRs and we found one where they had a 9th grade student who had not had, on an IEP, a 9th grade student who had not had an evaluation since the 3rd grade. And that's where, while technically you might say, well, the operating standards allow us to do that, it is not in the best interest of the student. And if you got into a complaint or due process situation with something like that, you probably would not be in a very good position. So that's what we'd like to say right up front about the waivers. Yes, you can do it, but be very, very careful in using those. Any questions on waivers?
No, Greg, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt real quick.
No.
If you are from KIPP Columbus, we're going to put a sign-in sheet in the chat box just because we have to keep track of your attendance for training purposes. So I'm going to put a link to a sign-in in the chat box. If you are from KIPP Columbus and only KIPP Columbus, if you can go into that and just sign your name and your position within the district, we would appreciate that. All right.
Okie dokie. Also, as we go through the presentation, we like to keep this informal. The questions that we've found in the past are really an important part of the process. So, as we move through stuff, if you have a question, stop us. I would rather answer the questions in context of where we are in the presentation than wait till the end. If you do have questions that you want, an individual technical assistance on, put a note in the chat, and we will be glad to talk with you individually if you'd prefer that. Okay, here we go. What are we going to do here? I got to get my slides to work. Purpose of today's training, what we're going to do today is mainly go over what the requirements are in the operating standards for the education of children with disabilities. Here's a hot link, and we checked all these hot links. You can download a copy of this presentation and use it yourself. All these hot links are active, and you can use those to reach all these sites. So the first one is we're going to talk a lot about what's in the operating standards. That's our first purpose today. The second purpose is we want to talk about the different tiers of support that are offered in the state of Ohio to districts and community schools. Tier 1 is really it's the basic training. It's the initial training that everybody in special ed should have per OEC. OEC developed these universal support materials so that you would have a good foundation that was consistent statewide, and you would have information that you could download and use as a reference. One of the things that we have a little difficulty with is there's lots of best practice stuff floating around out there, and sometimes best practice is confused with compliance, or it overlaps compliance. And one of the things that we ask OEC to do is, if you're going to put something in place that a district and community school is going to be held to, we'd like to have that in writing. So what they've done is they've developed these universal support materials. And there's two pieces of it. There's the school age piece up here and the early learning down here. But here's what you really need to pay attention to when it comes to the tier 1 stuff. This is on the ODE website. And what we have done, when we found this to be very helpful, is they have transcripts of each of these training modules. And what we've done is download and printed these transcripts and use those as information in writing that we can use to validate what we're doing regarding special ed. So we suggest you go in there and take a look at those. And you'll also see, let me get down here, that's the ETR part. There's the IEP part, and down here, secondary transition. So those are all on one page, and they're very, very helpful. Okay, the other one is this is the early learning modules, and it's the same deal. You've got transcripts in here for all those. We suggest you get those printed out as well. Okay. The other thing that OEC has is, I lost my cursor, there it is. OEC has some sites up that you may have seen from us in the past. They're working on those right now. The information that was up there before is in transition. So what we link to this site today is the special ed page that has all the stuff on it. I don't know how far along OEC is in getting their site back up, but just be aware that they are updating it right now, and that information should be available sometime this year. But in the meantime, you're more than welcome to use the materials we have on the SST site. Okay. Okay, so that's tier 1. Tier 1 is your basic training. That's what everybody should have. Tier 2 is what we're doing today. And this training was really developed as a train the trainer model, so that district administrators could get information, take it back to staff people at their districts and community schools, and use that information to train locally. And that's really what the purpose of today's training is. I think we have folks here that are not necessarily administrators, and that's perfectly all right. We open this up to everybody, and you're more than welcome. If you're an IS or related services person, you're welcome to use these materials as well. Tier 3 is what happens if you're lucky enough to either get a complaint or get involved in OEC monitoring of some sort. The Tier 3 training typically involves a series of year-long events that SST and OEC are both involved with. And that's limited to a few districts and community schools throughout the state. This year, everybody's sitting there saying, oh my God, is that us this year? We have one district identified in the region right now. And that's all that we know of. That doesn't mean that they can't add. Typically, if we get a complaint, and that can occur at any time during the year, that'll throw a district or community school into Tier 3. But right now, we only have one district, and that district knows who they are. Okay, my cursor keeps disappearing. Okay, what do we want to do today? We have some learning objectives. We try to model what we like to see out in the schools. First thing we want to do today is we want to know what the essential elements of the ETR are. What are the pieces and parts? We want to talk about some of the quality issues for strengthening the compliance component of the ETR process. We want to talk about what some of the specific requirements are for completing certain components, particularly when we get back into the SLD stuff. We'll talk about some specifics for that. And then we, of course, want to go over the importance of the quality of the ETRs when it comes to connecting them to the IEPs. Any questions about what we're going to do? Okay. As far as the essential elements goes, these are the same pieces and parts that we've been dealing with for the past, really, I think since 2014, when the operating standards were updated last. My memory, I think 2015 is the last time we had any substantial changes to forms or anything, but these are basically the same pieces and parts that you've been working with, and you're familiar with them. You're generally doing a pretty good job of addressing all this stuff. So this, today's going to be more of a review than anything else for most of us. As far as the process goes and what some of the timeline, the critical timelines are, we just want to remind you that once you get your initial referral, you have 30 days to decide whether or not you're going to do an evaluation or not. And you don't have to necessarily do an evaluation. That's a team decision. Of course, you're going to want to talk with the parents and make sure they're involved in the process. Make sure that you have all the essential information you need to make that decision whether to evaluate or not. But you can say, we don't suspect a disability right now, and no, we're not going to evaluate. You're going to do a PRO1, of course, to make sure that you've got that covered and the parents are fully informed of why you're making that decision. That's really important. If you decide to evaluate, the second timeline that's really critical is once you receive the signed consent form from the parents, you're going to want to date and timestamp that when you receive it. And from the date that you put on there, the date and timestamp, you have 60 days to get your evaluation done and to have your eligibility determination meeting. So you've got 30 days to decide if you're going to evaluate. If you are, once you get the signed consent, you've got 60 days to get the ETR done. And then after that, you have a maximum of 30 days to get your IEP in place if the student's qualified for services. Here again, this is a review. Just remember your 30, 60, 30, and you'll be in good shape. What typically happens, for those of you that have had the pleasure of being involved in Indicator 11 of the SPP profiles, Indicator 11 is those districts and community schools that fail to meet the 60-day timeline on any one ETR that initial ETR that they may have completed in the last school year. And what happens when that occurs is you get a letter from OEC saying that you're non-compliant, and there are some hoops that you need to jump through to make those corrections so that doesn't happen again. Just so you guys know, it is 100% compliance. That means if you do 1,000 initial ETRs and you're delinquent on one, regardless of the reason, you're going to end up doing a corrective action plan for, excuse me, for Indicator 11. And we'll know in December what, who all that involves. Typically, I think last year, Indicator, did we have 21, Steve? I can't remember how many we had for sure. I think we had about 20, but what's interesting about that is in every single case of the non-compliances in our region, it was like 1 or 2. You guys are doing overall a really good job of getting those done. It's just sometimes there's a counting error, sometimes a student's absent and you couldn't get the evaluation done. But typically a district or community school has 1 or 2 or 3 out of compliance out of several. And we don't have any major systemic problems anywhere in our region. At least we didn't last year. And by systemic, that means that you had 8 out of 20 were non-compliant. We're not seeing that. We're seeing 1s, 2s, and 3s. So the main thing that we suggest you do when it comes to the Indicator 11 stuff is make sure that you have a good calendar tracking process in place to keep track of those 60 days. And the best thing you can do is have 2 sets of eyes on that. Have somebody be the primary person to track your 60 days. And that's typically the school psych in many cases that's doing that. And then have a second set of eyes doing a secondary check to make sure that you don't bust that 60-day timeline. And if everybody does that, I think we can really reduce the number of non-compliances we have in the region. So I beat that pretty much to death. Any questions about the 30, the 60, or the 30? Same information, same dates, same deadlines we've been dealing with for a long time. We good to move on? This is pretty riveting stuff, isn't it? Okay, as far as the forms that you want to focus on to get your evaluation process in place and going, you're going to want your PRO1 is your best friend. We're going to talk a little bit about PRO1s, particularly this afternoon in the IEP section, but your PRO1 is the place that the district and community school can document what they've done, why they've done it, and it serves as notice to the parents as to what you're planning to do. when do you hand out a PRO1? We used to have a brochure that described that, but sometimes the brochure didn't cover all the things. The main thing you want to remember about the PRO1 is if you're going to start or stop a service or make a change, you need to notify the parent in writing. And we used to have a saying that still applies, and that is, when in doubt, send it out. If you're not sure, document it on a PRO1 and get it in the parent's hands. In our Acela training, Bricker and Eckler have said numerous times, it's always better to have one piece of paper too much than one piece of paper that you really need but don't have. So if you're not sure, do a PRO1. Second form in the evaluation process is you need the referral, of course. That's how this all gets kicked off. Your PRO2 is your parent invitation. Make sure that that you document and keep copies of those because the invitations are critical. The planning form, the school age planning form or the early childhood planning form, that's a piece of the PRO6. We're going to talk about some specifics with that when we get down here a little further. So we'll defer that. The consent for evaluation, as I said, the consent is what starts the 60-day clock ticking. And the clock starts ticking when you receive it and put a date and a time on it, date and time stamp. Now, this is important. If you don't put a date and time stamp on it, the 60-day clock starts ticking when the parents dated the form. So if they dated it a week ago and signed it and sent it to you and you don't date and time stamp it, you're going to lose a whole week to get the evaluation done. So that's important. And then a prior written notice after you get everything planned, you've got the planning form done, you've talked with the parents, they're fully informed of what's going on. You do a PRO1 to summarize what the evaluation process is going to entail and get that in their hands as well. Okay, any questions about those forms? We're going to talk about it more in a little detail below.
I have a question, Mr.
Yeah.
Matthews. My name is Leela. I'm the school psych here for KIPP Columbus.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to find out if you had any guidance or what you thought about, we start using DocuSign during the pandemic to get all of our signatures, collect all of our signatures. And so any guidance, or do you think that's I like it, but is that appropriate?
Yeah, when OEC or ODE put up on their website the different forms or different ways that you can obtain signatures now, and electronic signatures was one of them. And what we have to do is we have to document how those are going to be, how those signatures are being collected. And we're going to talk about that down here in just a little bit. But you might want to go back to the ODE site, and if you can't find it, pop me an email and I'll get it to you. But the electronic signatures were acceptable. Yeah.
And I had a second question regarding like the planning. I'm sorry if I cut someone off.
Sure.
I didn't get to it regarding, we use Google Sheets to kind of track referrals. And I always was like a little bit uncomfortable with that because it's an intake referral. It's not we suspect a disability referral, but I always wondered, because we have something that says a special education referral in a Google form, and then when we're dating the special education, like actual referral, it's the day of the planning meeting. And so I always wondered if that was a good process that we had.
I'm not sure I follow you completely there.
Want me to repeat it and clarify a little bit?
Yeah, the critical form is the consent form when it comes to the dates. The planning form, are you dating that during do you have planning meetings?
Yes, I do have planning meetings, and for those who can't come, I summarize my meetings in a Google slide that I send to everyone. So
Okay.
everyone's aware that we had the meeting, everyone's getting the same information, and then I dated the day that I send that planning form.
Okay.
Can
I think we
Can I pop in
probably,
here real quick, Greg?
yeah,
Like that planning meeting, I think what you need to remember too, there needs to be a PRO1 from that planning meeting.
yeah.
That's a very important step that I think people sometimes overlook. And that's anytime you're having a meeting, there should be a prior written notice done. That's how you make sure you always have all your ducks in a row.
Yeah.
So make sure, and that's also where, when you were talking about those electronic signatures or whatever, however, put that in your prior written notice. You need to notify everyone how those signatures were collected. And it could say that some were in person and some were done digitally as well.
Well, thank you. That helps me because I do make note at the last question of the prior written notice, which I send out the same day as the consent form, the same day as the planning meeting. I do make note in that last question that we collect signatures via DocuSign.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I was doing what was right.
Given your guys' situation right now, we probably ought to sit down and talk about that whole process from beginning to end, and also talk about how you're documenting it. So after we're done today, we probably need to get together and just sit down and step through that whole process from beginning to end. That sound like a good idea?
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I can turn my video on too. So if we don't have like the planning meeting, like for reevaluation wise, like if there's not an actual like sit down planning meeting, can there be just one PRO1? You know that like
No.
we're starting. Okay, so can you explain that? I
Yeah,
don't.
you're going to, the purpose of the PRO1 is to inform the parents of what you're proposing to do before it happens. And well, first of all, how are you doing the planning for the reevaluation? Because you need to have some kind of process in place to decide what's going to occur.
Right, and that's I just kind of conference with everyone, and then I personally like talk with parents
Yeah.
and like go
And
over that.
you complete a planning form, right, out of the
Yes.
PRO6, and then you summarize. Yeah, you need to, based on what your team decides to do and what the parents are providing information on, what you need to do is summarize that on a PRO1 as to what you're proposing to do in the reevaluation. Does that make sense? Which
I
parent?
guess so. And in regards to the comment that was just made, like I am giving like informed consent. Like I sit down with parents specific. Okay, so like, I mean, even over like a phone call, but like I go through the actual like planning form completely. So
Yeah.
are you saying like I should have I don't know. So
If I
like,
can pop in here, because this might answer somebody else to ask the question. What do you do if the eligibility and planning meeting together? You should never have a planning meeting and an eligibility, because now you've predetermined
Yeah.
what you're going to evaluate and evaluating before you've ever provided that consent. So they need to be separate pieces. So if you make a phone call, for example, Kiera, you still should be sending something home to the parent and obtaining consent to evaluate. That's why they would not be at the same
no,
time.
that's I always do the planning form before consent, like because it's informed consent, you know, like but I guess my thing is with like PRO1s, I should be sending a PRO1 saying that we're going to talk about the planning form, and then also another PRO1 saying that we did do the planning form and got consent. Is that correct?
So you could do a PRO1 that had your planning form and the day you obtained consent together.
Yeah.
There was another question that somebody said, can we do eligibility and planning together? And those you
Yeah, I
cannot
know.
do together.
Yeah, I mean, that one, that confused me as well, but like I guess mine's not talking about eligibility. I'm talking about like when there isn't a sit down, like everyone is in one big meeting together talking about planning, because that's unrealistic, like for every single reevaluation. Like, I just want to make sure that I'm doing like PRO ones right. So typically what I've been doing is writing like so I only write one PRO one that, you know, planning and consent has been obtained. So are you saying that there should be a PRO one before I even, you know,
There needs to be
attempt
a
for
PR.
planning and consent? So there should be a PRO one, then get planning and consent, then do another PRO one, then do the evaluation, then hold the meeting, then hold another PRO one? Just making sure, like,
The thing that you want to remember is before you do the reevaluation, the parent needs to know everything that's going to be going on. So
right, and I do that with the planning form, you know, before any evaluation even, I don't even
well,
touch a kid
that's the
unless I have that
critical
written
part.
consent.
And then afterwards, you're going to want to send a PRO one explaining what the results were and what you're going
Yeah.
to continue to do after that. That's the big pieces.
My question is before even an evaluation even happens. It sounded like you're saying there should be a PRO one, then planning and consent, then another PRO one, then the evaluation, then another PRO one.
For the initials, yes.
Okay, but not for reevaluations.
For
like,
reevals, you need to have a PRO one for explaining what the planning process concluded and what the evaluations are that are going to take place. And
okay,
then you
so
need a PRO one to explain the results.
okay, so that is what I do. I just okay. So I
Okay,
was confused. It sounded like there needed to be 3, and I've only been doing 2, you know, one before and one
Yeah.
after. So I just want to make sure that that's right. But yeah,
Yeah.
initial wise, you know, I get the referral. They do the PRO one on whether we suspect or not. We hold the meeting, planning. They're planning and consent, then the PRO one, you know, whatever, that meeting, the evaluation meeting with eligibility, and then another PRO one.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
And
you
I
got
just
it. I
have,
think you got it.
yeah, so to layer on top of that, you only have to give a PRO one if the referral's being denied, correct? You don't have to do a PRO one if you're accepting it. Or do
I
you do
would
it in
do a
both?
PRO one explaining what you're going to do. Yes.
Okay, so PRO one for any decision that we make,
For
whether
the-
we're
yes.
moving forward or
Yes.
we're denying it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
I think an easy way to remember is if you're questioning whether or not you need a PRO one, go ahead and do one. It's not going to hurt to do a little extra step just to document whatever decisions are being made.
So I just wanted to clarify, I think I worded my question wrong. I didn't mean eligibility and planning meeting together. What I meant was if you hold a meeting telling the parent that you want to like begin testing and stuff, and like after they, you know, like send in a referral, if you hold a meeting to tell them like, oh yeah, we're going to go forward with it. And then you also do a planning, like you fill out the planning form when you're having that meeting with them, telling them, yes, we're going to. Do you need to send out 2 invitations if you're just going to do that together?
Invitations?
Yeah, like, cause I sent out an invitation, like to the meeting, telling them, like when we hold the meeting, telling them like, yes, we're going to proceed with testing,
Mhm.
like you asked. Like I send out a meeting invitation for that, but if we're also filling out the planning form, then is it okay that there isn't a separate parent invite for a planning meeting?
So you're going to do both of those things at one meeting.
Yeah,
I think your one invitation, I would note on the invitation what was going to occur at that meeting though.
yeah, check
Document
both
that.
boxes.
Yeah,
Okay, got it.
okay.
If I do have one question because it pertains to what we're talking about here. So my colleague and I were kind of having a discussion about whether or not the consent form should happen first and then the planning form, or the other way around. Because someone had just mentioned that they do the planning form first because technically it would be more informed consent if we are giving the consent afterward. So is that the proper way to do it, to do the planning form first and then
Yes.
get consent?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's critical. In fact, that's what OEC will look at when they monitor you, is they're going to want to see that what you had planned was reflected in the consent form. So you're going to put what's going on in the evaluation in the consent form and then also in the PRO1.
Okay. But usually, you know, we get the parent signs the consent form and the planning form on the same day. So on like
Yes,
the
if
date
you
doesn't
do-
really show.
It's okay if you do the planning process first and then the consent process. If it's on the same day, you can do that.
Mhm.
What you never want to do is have the consent form before the planning form.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
what you said is exactly right. In order for a parent to give informed consent, you have to have described to them what the planning process is described as, what's going to entail during the reeval. Also, just while we're on this topic, if you complete the planning form, and let's say, for instance, you suspect SLD, and you get part of the way through the evaluation, and you go, oh my gosh, I think maybe this is ID, and you did not include an adaptive behavior assessment on the original planning form, you're going to have to go back and adapt or add to the planning form the adaptive behavior assessment, and then you're going to have to do another consent form getting permission to do the adaptive behavior assessment. So that's, just keep that in mind. Just the really important piece to this is whatever you're going to do during the evaluation, the parent has to know about it and give consent. That's the bottom line to it.
Oh, well, thank you for clarifying that, because actually that does happen sometimes. But I don't usually give another consent. I just document in a prior written notice that I spoke with the parent and that the parent agreed that we're going to add this and this to the planning form. So you're saying that we need another
You
signed
should get another
consent?
consent. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Also, let me also say, just to make your life just a little more miserable, that consent forms require real signatures. OEC will not accept a note saying consent provided over the phone. They want a signature of some sort, and it can be electronic, as we talked about earlier, but keep that in mind. As yeah, they want signatures on consent forms.
I have a question in terms of the timeline for how long to wait for consent. Basically, if a parent doesn't get back to you, do you just keep trying, or is there a timeline in which we
There's
can?
there's no specific timeline, but what it says in the operating standards is you have to make quote unquote reasonable attempts. And typically what OEC has said in the past, and they've changed this in the last year or so, what OEC used to say was 3 attempts was sufficient, but they needed to be made in different ways, like telephone, email, US mail. You need to try different ways. They used to say 3, but lately they've just said reasonable. They're not saying 3 like they used to. They're just saying reasonable. So keep that in mind. There's just so you guys know, there's some precedent set in due process hearings and stuff like that, that historically the 3 have been sufficient, but for some reason they're saying reasonable. I'm thinking 3 still makes sense.
So then if we do our 3 attempts, does that mean that they'll have to go through the referral process again? Does that mean like we kind of like push it to the side and then have to do
Your
it again?
team's going to have to decide how to handle that.
Okay,
Um,
I just didn't know if there were any laws around like kind of putting it in archive situation and then
Not really. What happens is you'll have your team meeting, and if the parent fails to respond, and you try to contact and just document. The main thing is to remember in special education, regardless of what happens, just make sure you've got good documentation of it. And when you try to get consent and you can't get it, if you've documented and you have a paper trail on that, typically your district or community school will be in pretty good shape if you would get a complaint or a question later on.
Okay, and then last question for now. What if like the scenario that you had previously mentioned where you start testing and then you realize you need to get consent again? Do you just halt all testing, or do you
No, you can proceed with what they've already approved. You can go ahead and complete all that. You just have to make sure you have written consent before you do the new piece.
Okay, so does that mean that we should just go ahead and just service that student based off of the testing that we have if the teacher, well, of course, if the parent approves, but
Yeah.
should we go ahead and just write the IEP based off of the information we have? If
You
they
can
don't
do
get
that.
consent? Okay,
There again, the circumstances, depends on your circumstances. You never want to have a break in service for kids that are receiving services. You want to continue providing. But typically if you're doing additional assessments or you're gaining more information, what you'll do is continue with what you're providing, and then once that new information is available, the team will review that, and if necessary, you can adapt the IEP.
okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry to keep this conversation going, but I just wanted to follow up on what, if we're not able to reach a parent to get consent. So my understanding is that there's a difference between initial evaluations and reevaluations when it comes to getting consent for an initial evaluation, there's no way we can do testing if we do not get consent from the parent.
Correct.
But what about in the case of reevaluations, because those are required by law? If we don't get consent for a reevaluation, what do we do? Do we just do a record review, or do we just move forward with the evaluation?
It's interesting that you brought it up, because this is one of those questions where you will want to talk to your attorney. And this is the reason why. In the operating standards on page 61, it talks about consent for reevaluations. And in there, in the operating standards, it says that if you attempt to get consent from the parent and you've made reasonable attempts, that you can proceed with the reevaluation. Okay, that's what it says. But in our Acela training, Bricker and Eckler have data and reason to say that if you do not have written consent, you should not proceed with the full reevaluation and do a record review instead. So there's some disconnect there. There's some legal precedents apparently that has been set that says you need written consent for reevaluations as well. But I don't know where that's coming from, but I brought that up in our training last year, and they said, oh no, you need consent for reeval. If you don't have it, do a record review. And that's why I would suggest you talk with your attorney, because that's, if Bricker and Eckler saying that, there's got to be a darn good reason for it. And I would be operate on the prudent side and say that, if we don't have consent, we're going to do record review. And you can do that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we
And I
better move
think-
on here.
Yep, as we move
as
on, if you
far
guys
as-
have more questions, please use the chat box and we'll respond to those. And if we don't have the answer, we'll get those answers to you.
Yeah.
So just please go ahead and keep asking your questions in the chat.
We should tell you today that our answers are $1 a piece, but right answers are $5, okay? No, seriously, You know, there's times we don't know the answers to questions, and what we'll do after sessions like this is we'll put a list of questions together and send them to OEC and ask them to respond. When we get the responses back, we'll blast them out to everybody. So yeah, please put questions in the chat box if we don't get to them, and we'll address them in that manner. Okay, as far as required and optional forms go, this is on the ODE website too. The thing you want to kind of keep an eye on, you see they've got revision dates on this stuff. And so that's where you can find all the forms that ODE likes. Most of you guys are using the commercially produced programs that have all these forms and stuff in them. Just be aware that if you're working with a vendor that provides this stuff, that the forms that the vendor use have to comply with all the components of the state required forms. And the vendors typically know that, so that shouldn't be a problem for you. But that's where you find all that stuff. Oh, referral form. What do we want to say about the referral form? The main thing about your referral form, as we said before, this kicks the process off, that it starts the evaluation. Just try to get as much complete information as you can, particularly regarding the educational history. And I'm an old developmental psychologist. I like to know about the developmental history too, but try to get this as complete as possible. One thing that we suggest you don't do is don't hand a parent a referral form. These are kind of intimidating. What we would suggest you do is sit down with the parent and go through these things with them, and you guys fill the form out. Here again, you know, this form's been in place for, I think this is over 10 years old, and we haven't changed anything on it yet. Any questions on the referral form? Okay. Prior written notice, we already talked about that quite a bit. Just a reminder, and this started up with the pandemic stuff. They want you to put on the PRO1 how you conducted your methods of conducting the ETR. So if you did some of the stuff virtually and some of it in person, you would want to note that. And you also want to document how you got the signatures. So put that on, as Kim said earlier, put that on your PRO1. We good on that? Okay. When it comes to PRO1s, Bricker and Eckler have included a really nice, thorough, complete example of what they like to see on a PRO1. And so what we've done is we've given you the hot link to that. My cursor disappeared again. We gave you the hot link for that. And this is, let me show you how it's going to come up. Let me see. What you're going to want to do is, this is going to go to the SST website. You want to go to session 5, handout 3. Okay. So this is what it's going to look like. There's session 1. And there's handout 3. So there's, and you can see they really go into detail on this. So anyhow, that's a gold standard PRO1 provided by Bricker and Eckler, and we thank them for their allowing us to use that for all of our trainings. We guys good on that? Parent participation. This is an optional form. OPO means optional, OP9. And this is just a sample of a way that you can track how you contact parents. If you get into a compliance or due process situation, these things are critical. Make sure that you always track and document how you're attempting to contact parents. Okay? Any questions on the OP09? Going once, going twice. Preschool evaluations. This is your preschool evaluation form, the same one that we've been using for a long, long time. On that evaluation, when you're planning your evaluation, there are different ways that you collect data. And this is nothing new. This is the way it's been for a while. When it down here toward the bottom, we got physical exam, vision exam, and audiological. We often get questions, do we have to do that for every student? No. You have to do a physical examination if the disability is primarily the result of something physical. So if your disability is primarily the result of something physical, you're going to need to have the student get a physical exam. Same deal with if the disability is primarily a visual impairment, you're going to want a thorough visual exam. Same thing for audiology. If hearing's the major impairment, you're going to want to have a thorough and complete audiology. Nothing new there. We good on that? Okay. Now, when it comes to doing the rest of the evaluation process, OEC, or I'm sorry, Early Childhood Office is saying that you have to use all forms of these assessment methods in the evaluation process. It doesn't mean you have to use one for each area, but you have to include all 4 of these in the total evaluation. Is that a good way to say that, Aaron?
Yes, so if it's an area of concern, if a child has speech language as the area of concern, you need to make sure that you have all 4 going across that planning form, saying that you did a norm reference assessment, criterion, an observation, and an interview. If behavior is not necessarily an area of concern, you would not need all 4 of those criteria listed.
Okay. And there again, the preschool stuff is a little different than the school age. And what you do on the, you have some required areas or types of assessments that need to be done, and you're not going to see requirements on the school age piece. We okay to move on with this one? Okay. School age planning.
Greg, before you
Yeah.
go on, can you repeat that about preschool? Because the way she just said it, I just want, can she re-say that? Because the way she just said it is in speech, you would need to evaluate under all 4 of those areas, but at the bottom, it says areas of development must be addressed using at least one method.
So when you look at the planning form on a preschool planning form, you have all the areas of development listed there on the left-hand side: adaptive behavior, cognition, communication. You need to assess in all of those areas in at least one of the areas listed in blue across to the right.
Okay, that's what I kind of read, but the way you said it, it made me think that I had to do all of those areas for speech in all different.
So you're going to have at least one area of concern. So if that area of concern is communication, you should have marked to the right-hand side of communication each of those boxes to the right-hand side in blue.
If that's the only area that's there. Otherwise,
well, for any area of concern. So if you're concerned about communication, you're also concerned about cognition, then all 4 of those areas across to the right under cognition, communication should be marked, and then at least one area to the right in all of those other areas.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okie dokie. We're going to move on to the school age planning form. On this form, you're going to have a pull down menu under data for review. And you're going to have 3 things to choose from. You're going to have sufficient data available, additional testing or data is needed, or not applicable. Okay? If you choose sufficient data available or additional testing data needed, then that must be addressed somewhere in a part 1. Okay. So if you mark on there that general intelligence is sufficiently available, then you need to talk about general intelligence in a part 1 somewhere. It would likely be the psych that would talk about that. If you mark sufficient data available, let's say for instance on on behavior, let's get down to observations. Observations a little bit squirrely. For observations, if you're going to say additional testing or data is needed, then somebody needs to talk about behavior in the part 1, in a part 1, okay? The only time that you do not address something in a part 1 is if you mark not applicable, okay? We good on that? There's, you know, that's the same thing we've been saying for the past few years. Also, something we want to point out is personal responsible. And this wording on the planning form is just a little over here where it says person responsible for assessment and report. What that really ought to say is person responsible for collecting data or for acquiring data. Because what happens down in here, information provided by parent, for instance. Now that's not really an assessment or report, but somebody needs to talk with the parents and get that information. You cannot put the parent is responsible for anything, or the student. Over here in the responsible part, this has to be a school person or a professional of some sort. And this is who's going to get the information for the ETR team. Also, over here, when it comes to persons responsible, you can don't put names in there necessarily, but put the titles of the persons responsible. Okay. Regarding names of people, up here, they do want a name for the team chairperson. And for team members, they typically want the titles of who the team members are going to be: speech pathologist, psychologist, general ed teacher, intervention specialist. So you can put titles in there, put a name of the chairperson and the title in there, put both in name and title. And then suspected disabilities on that piece and part right there, you can put more than one. A few years ago, they saying, oh, you have to limit it to one. No, you can put more than, you can put SLD and ID in there. But when you put SLD and ID in there, as we mentioned previously, you have to make sure that all of the required special assessments are completed for each of those disability categories. Okay, we good on that? Okay, when you get back on to completing the part ones, we're going to talk about using the language on the planning form. Use these same words, and we suggest you put little subheadings back in your part ones. What we often see for general intelligence, people will put in cognitive assessment. And what that does is that puts the OEC reviewer in a position of having to make that interpretation. We have people that sometimes confuse adaptive behavior with behavior assessment. So if you're doing an adaptive behavior assessment, say that. So use this language of these categories back in your part ones when you're completing those. The next piece we already talked about that's important, your planning must be done before your consent signed. the parents must be fully aware of what they're consenting to. And then you have to do a PRO1 after the planning form is completed and the consent is obtained. We already talked about that. And we already talked about if you have a change, you got to redo this whole process. You got to get the planning form revised, you got to get the consent again, you got to do a PRO1. We good on that? Any questions on that particular form? Pretty riveting stuff, isn't it? Mostly review so far, I hope. Moving along. As far as the other sections that are on that planning form, the date of the plan is when you do the planning. The operating standards do not require a face-to-face meeting. However, you do need input of the entire team. And you might do that by phone, you might do it by email. The main thing is you've got some documentation of what was said, why it was said, and what you're going to do.
Oh, okay, all done, huh?
Yeah.
I appreciate it, buddy.
What? Okay. Initial evaluation. What is an initial? An initial means that the student's never been identified before. That's one possibility. A second one is if they were in special ed and the IEP team got together and said, this student's making sufficient progress, we're going to exit them from special ed. And in EMIS, they went back into general education. And a year later, you go, whoops, I think we may have done that a little prematurely. We think maybe we want to put this student back in special ed. That would be an initial evaluation, bringing that student back in. There has to be a break in special ed services. And this last one, if the student moves in from out of state with an IEP and you conduct an evaluation to determine whether or not this student meets Ohio's standards for eligibility criteria, that would be an initial as well. We suggest, one of the things, accepting ETRs and IEPs from out of state's kind of sticky. You'll get different eligibility criteria across some states. You'll get ETRs that consist of check boxes on IEPs from other states. I think Florida's still doing that. So the prudent thing to do is on out-of-state students is to do an evaluation with them. What I would do is, the IEP, you can take a look at it, see if you agree with it. I would continue to provide services in the interim, and then do another evaluation to see if, number one, if they're eligible, and number two, if you need to adapt that IEP. That makes sense?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that. So so if we're considering it an initial evaluation, do we have to fill out the referral for evaluation section and like document data from interventions and kind of as if we're starting over with the student? And then another thing is what's the timeline for that? So if a student transfers from out of state, at some point in the year, how long do we have to complete the evaluation?
Well, the first question is do all the paperwork. Don't skip pieces of paperwork. Make sure that you have a complete initial evaluation packet when you're done. Number two, what it says in the operating standards is a reasonable amount of time. And OEC is bounced around on that. We've heard in the past that a grading period is a reasonable amount of time. You might follow what the initial evaluation timelines are. If you're going to do the initial, you need to get that done within 60. For the reevaluations, when you're doing reevaluations, it's reasonable times what it says.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. As far as data available, typically And this is typically, current data means it's not over a year old. I know in some instances, IQ scores and intellectual assessments that are older than 1 year for older students might be acceptable. And just be careful there again, if you're using data that's older than a year, just, make sure you're pretty certain that that's reflecting what the student's abilities really are. And then on the last thing is for the signatures, you want a date and each person signs the form.
Hey,
These
Greg,
are yeah.
before we move on, Megan asked, she said she had a question that was hard to kind of put into words. So Megan, can you unmute and go ahead and ask your question about reevaluations?
So part of my role, I do a lot of consulting with other districts, and the question keeps coming up. I had a district say that they did not agree with the incoming ETR and that they just did not feel that this was reflective of the student. So my question to them was, how well do you know this student? And they're like, well, they've been in our district for 4 days. And my advice was, a team of professionals agreed otherwise that had access to this child far longer than what you did. So when a district is making a decision of whether or not to transfer in the ETR, are there certain parameters that we should be abiding by? Because our best practice, I'm the director of special ed at Indian Lake. When a document comes to us, we're assuming that the team made the best decision for eligibility for that specific child, and we're simply looking for compliance errors. If we find compliance errors, then we do not transfer in that document. But can schools just say, I'm not going to agree with this information and not transfer it in? Or is that kind of a FAPE violation in a way?
Well, you're going to need to continue to provide some services based on what you know that student needs, but it's going to be a team decision if you want to reevaluate or not. That's, that's what you guys have to do, or they have to decide.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. My timekeeper is telling me we need to move along, or we're going to be here for dinner. Okay. Okay. These are the disability categories that have certain extra evaluation components required. Just make sure if you're doing SLD, ID, MDVI, or HI, you review the operating standards and make sure you're hitting all those pieces and parts that must be done. Reason for evaluation. This is looking at the evaluation form. You can use your evaluation must be documented why you're doing this evaluation. The prior written notice and the ETR has to relate to the needs of the child. And the other reason for doing the evaluation, don't just say got to do a 3-year reeval. Put in there that you need to assess the students' current skill levels, academic things, and explain why you're doing the eval, not just saying it's a 3-year timeline. 3-year timeline, if you just say that, it'll be non-compliant. As far as the consent form, we already covered most of this. The parents must provide consent for the evaluation. Make sure that you date and timestamp that, and make sure that the parents receive the PR05 along with the ETR planning form. Okay, moving along. ETR cover page. It's a good idea every now and then to make sure that the people on your team do review these instructions. Make sure that everybody's aware of all the pieces and parts and components that need to be completed for each one. Down in here, they talk about in part 3 for SLD, when you have to do that stuff and what needs to be done. So just make sure that people are aware of that. This is all pretty much the same stuff up here. For the reevals, here again, the referral date is not critical for reevals. You can actually leave that blank up here. But make sure that that you do, like I said, for reeval, I would have a consent for the reevals and have that date in there as well. Okay, we good on that? this stuff's all the same: district of residence where the kids live, district of servants if they live somewhere and they're going to school elsewhere, like a DD school or something like that. Be aware that community school is the district of residence and the district of service. We still get some confusion about that. Community schools are district of residence. Parent box, that's if you have parents that are living different places, you can duplicate that box. Nothing new there. We already talked about the initial and reeval. The date of the meeting, make sure that your ETR reflects that it occurred, if it did in fact occur, within 60 days of consent. Date of your last ETR, if you know what that is, put that in there. Already said referral date. Make sure that you've got your, for your initial, you got your prior written notice. We already talked about that. Reeval, reasonable amount of time. We talked about that. And consent, we got that. Okay, part ones. Part ones. Steve, we're scheduled to 11:30, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, good.
Got about an hour and a few minutes left.
Okay. Why don't we, let's take a 6-minute break, get some coffee, stretch your legs. We'll come back right at 10:30 and we'll start on the part ones. Okay? Okay, here we go. I hope you got a hot cup of coffee. As far as the part one goes, as I said, you guys are doing a pretty good job when it comes to the assessments and the descriptions and the implications. Those are the big pieces and parts there. And overall, you're doing a pretty good job of getting those areas completed. As we said earlier, on the part ones, if you mark sufficient data or additional testing, you have to, it's got to be on somebody's planning form somewhere. It's got to be in here somewhere. That's the big thing there. Preschool, we already talked about. Preschool, we have to mention that we want information from Part C for the kids that are transitioning from early intervention. We need criterion reference assessments. We do need observations, and we need norm reference evaluation as well. So as we said previously, those components are all required for early childhood. As far as for the school age stuff, and this applies to early childhood, you can use all of these assessment procedures, observations, interviews, review of records, scientific research-based interventions, curriculum-based, norm reference, and classroom-based. All these pieces of information may be useful, and you may include those in your evaluation. Nothing new there. That's the same thing we've been doing. This is just another graphic that, as far as the assessments results go, what you have for your three major components is they want the summary of results, they want the description of needs, and then the implications for instruction and progress monitoring. Okay. As far as the summary of assessment results go, they want you to, to essentially say, what did we find out? They want a clear and understandable description of what the student did, what their performance was, and how does that relate back to what the referral says? Or are the assessments that we're seeing for this part one, are they agreeing with the referral information? Are they not? They also want you to identify any conditions or limitations that may influence the validity of the results. For instance, if the student was not attentive and fell asleep during assessments, that's the kind of thing you would want to report. You guys do a good job of that. And if more than one area is listed on a part one, make sure you identify the results in the narrative. Don't just put test scores, or some folks actually have cut and paste sections of protocol summaries. Don't do that. Make sure you put the information in the narrative, and we suggest that you do not attach protocol to the ETR form, because when you attach those forms, that becomes part of the legal document, and you don't want to go there. Okay, we good on that? As far as descriptions of the needs go, we want to know what area they are. And we want to make sure that one thing that we do have a little bit of difficulty with in the region when it comes to evaluating the ETRs, we sometimes mix up what the needs are with the implications, and folks combine those things. What you want to remember about needs is that's the specific area that the student's having some difficulty with, and what did the test assessments, what did the observation, what did the classroom-based assessments tell us about that particular area? And then when it comes down to the implications part, we want to know, okay, we're seeing an indication that this student's 2 years behind in math calculation. Based on that, what does that mean for the IEP team And how will that need impact what the IEP does? If you have a student with a really short attention span and that's listed as a behavioral need, you might want to say something like, well, the implication would be because of the short attention span, instructions need to be short and broken down into incremental pieces. So keep the need, make sure that you focus on the need and the assessment results that indicate that. And then in the implications, that's where you talk about, well, what does that mean for the classroom performance? And then you also have to say something about progress monitoring. And this is, we've gone back and forth with OEC on this too. Progress monitoring, we suggest you provide a general statement, would benefit from having progress monitored on a monthly basis, or progress monitored on a regular basis as determined by the IEP team. Make sure you say something about progress monitoring. But then the other thing that OEC says is we're not supposed to predetermine. Okay, we've heard that for the last 40 years. Don't predetermine services that are going to be on the IEP in the ETR. That's the IEP team's job. So when you talk about the implications, you want to say something like, the student may benefit from speech therapy services addressing blah, blah, blah. They still like to see the student may benefit from. So keep that in mind. We do not want to predetermine. Use the language you're comfortable with, but don't say the student will have. Say something like the student may benefit from. We good on that? Okay. Part two. Part two is where we put all this stuff together and come up with a summary. On the intervention summary for the evaluation, the initial and the re-eval, you fill out those things. And I'll give you a clue on what to put in the re-eval one in just a second. We want to know the reason, the summary of information provided by parents, observations, medical, blah, 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 blah. We're going to summarize all this stuff. Like I said, for both the initial and re-eval, don't leave it blank. And it needs to refer to actual interventions. Do not put accommodations or modifications in there. Okay, we're talking about interventions. In the initial evaluation, they want you to talk about research-based interventions. How long did you do it? How often did you do it? What was the outcome? And what was the decision the team made regarding the results of the assessment? Sounds kind of like RTI, MTSS kind of stuff, doesn't it? That's what it is. So that's what they're looking for on the initials. And here again, you guys have done a pretty darn good job of putting this stuff together. For re-evals, this one's just a little bit wonky. For re-evals, if you did additional interventions, and the operative word there is additional, that were provided outside of the IEP, then they want to know the same kind of thing. Same kind of RTI, MTSS kind of stuff. Okay? Well, what if you didn't do that? What if everything came out of the IEP process? If everything came out of the IEP process and other specific interventions weren't done, then you need to say something like this in this reevaluation box. No additional interventions were provided. It was determined by the team that the IEP special education supports and services were sufficient to meet the child's needs. Okay?
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a question and I've been answering some of them, but I'm gonna defer to you on this one. This is more up your school psych alley. Parent phone call. So they took a parent phone call they couldn't ask earlier. Apologize. I saw on the school age planning slide that data available needs to be accurate and not over 1 year old. Does this mean we can't summarize an assessment from a prior evaluation, i.e. general intelligence, since that assessment would have been given approximately 3 years prior?
Yeah, you can, yes, you can do that. You have to make a professional judgment on whether you think that information is pertinent or not. But for things like, general intelligence assessments and, for older kids, IQ scores and are pretty stable, and that's your call. You can do that. So it's not hard and fast. Just be cautious about doing that. Okay. Okay, we good to go on this statement? I would use almost that language of that's applicable, because we know that OEC likes this. They made it up. As far as reasons for evaluation on the part 2, we want to know what the referral has said. Also, like I said, for the reevals, do not just say 3-year reeval, say to assess students' current status and evaluate academic and behavioral performance, blah, blah, blah. Put in some academic and behavior language in there. Whoops. Information provided by the parent. You can pull information off the referral form if you want. And you can also, here again, if you're going to do behavioral checklists, do that with the parent. Be careful about handing them stuff and saying to fill it out. You may interview the parents or have had meetings with them, and the parents may also provide outside evaluations like from Children's Hospital or something like that. Make sure you include that pertinent information as well. Summary of observations. We had a little bit of confusion a couple of years ago about that. You need to do an observation for every evaluation you do, whether it be an initial or reeval. You need to have some kind of observation. If you're doing some kind of separate observation, you need to have parent consent for that. It needs to be take place. The observation needs to take place where the kids are learning. Here again, it should be current within 1 year. And if you have kids that are out of school for medical or disciplinary reasons, you can, quote unquote, make the observations in an environment appropriate for a child of that age. The question that came up is, if you're doing, last year was if you're doing observations of kids as part of the IEP process and the parents have provided consent for that, can you use those observations? And yes, you can. That's okay to do that. So for purpose of expediency, if you've got information available from the IEP process, the parents provided consent, do that. Now, if you have a student that, let's say, did not have behavior issues before, and the behavior springs up and you decide that you need to do some assessment, if you're going to do a brand new assessment that's never been done or included in the IEP, then yes, you would need to get consent to do that. Okay? So if you have observations that are already included in the IEP that address the areas that academic and behavior stuff that on the IEP, you can use it. But if you're doing new stuff, you need to get consent for that. We clear on that? Okay. Medical information, that's pretty self-explanatory. We want to know, if there's anything medically going on that's going to impact this student's education, FAPE. You need to have that in there as well. As far as summary of assessment results go, don't cut and paste from part 1 to part 2. We've gone around and around for the past several years about that. On one hand, I have people saying, I labored over my part 1 summary for hours, I got it perfect, and then you're saying I can't use it in the part 2. Well, ODE does not like to see you cut and paste stuff. So what I would suggest, this is what I used to ask people that I worked with to do. I am not a speech pathologist. I'm not an OT. I'm not a PT. I did not stay at the Holiday Inn last night. For the part 2s, for those related service specialists and the gen ed teacher and the ISs, I would ask them to write a summary paragraph to go in to the part 2. When I first started doing reports, I would labor over it, and I was always really uncomfortable saying stuff that I wasn't sure was correct or not. So what I suggest you do is get with your folks on your team and ask them to put together what goes in the summary of assessment results. Okay? Keep in mind you want to try to keep it as understandable as possible for the parents and the team members. I know sometimes, OT and PT stuff and speech people, those speech people have secret code that they write stuff in, I know, and make sure that you try to keep it as understandable as possible. Okay. As far as the educational needs go, your team wants to look at the needs that were identified in the part 1s and prioritize those and decide which of those belong in the part 2. Okay? And here again, the needs, you're going to need to tie the implications to those needs that are on the part 2. You're going to want to do the same thing as you did in the part 1s, tie the implications back to the needs. And this is, this piece and part here, the needs and the implications are going to really be critical to the development of the IEP, particularly the initial IEPs. So, this is the one place you want to really be concise if you can. One of the things that we've said in the past, and this seems to work well for folks, on the part 1s, put the needs and implications in kind of a narrative or paragraph format. But back on part 2, we had a district we were monitoring that did this, and it worked really well. They used bullet points for the needs and the implications. So they had number 1, behavioral need, behavior and needs, number 1 was behavior. And then in implications, number 1, implications for behavior in the classroom. And then they did 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and so on. And OEC, it liked that very much. It was very clear, and it was very concise information for the IEP team to use to decide what they were going to put on the IEP. Any questions on that? Moving along. And down here, as I said, this last one on this page, the implications you want to say may benefit from. Same pieces and parts as we saw in part 1. We want to see we want to know what the needs are, and we want to know what the implications are. We want to know what the progress monitoring is for each of those, and say may benefit from. Okay. Okay, moving along. Okay, SLD. How much time? Oh dear, we got to move along here. SLD. If you suspect SLD or are re-evaluating for SLD, you need to do this part. There is something different about the team members also. This is important. For when you're evaluating or reevaluating for SLD, you have to have all these other folks you got for all the other teams, but something that's different on this one is you have to have a team member who is qualified to conduct, not just interpret, but conduct individual diagnostic examinations of kids. So make sure when you're in your planning process, if you're suspecting SLD, make sure that you've got somebody on your team that can conduct diagnostics. Okay, that's something that's a little bit different. Oh, required notification. This is the same stuff you've been filling out for the last several years. This is for initial evaluations. For initial evaluations, the parents are supposed to know about this stuff before you actually conduct the evaluation. And this is essentially like RTI and MTSS kind of stuff. They want to know about what kind of data you collected and what kind of services you provided. What were your SDI type strategies for improving the learning? And parents have to have a notification that they can request an evaluation. So the big takeaway from this slide is, as you start to look at kids and say, yeah, we might be having to do a special ed evaluation here, and you're going to get them involved in an MTSS process, make sure that the parents are aware and get them involved in that up front, so you can make sure you've got this done before you actually get into the initial evaluation. You guys good on that? Okay. As far as the identified areas, you check the boxes for which the child is not achieving adequately. So the areas that we're having trouble in. And then when it comes down to actually making the eligibility determination, you choose either section B or section C. And you've got two options here. The first option, number B, is whether you used research-based intervention solely to make the determination. And quite frankly, I don't know anybody that's using just research-based intervention to make that determination. I've been asking people for years, and I don't know of anyone in our region that's doing that. What everybody seems to be doing is section C. And section C is patterns of strengths and weaknesses. It used to be in Ohio and other states that there was something called the discrepancy model that was used to identify SLD. And it was a pretty simple process. You gave the student an IQ test, you gave them an academic achievement test, you compared the scores, you looked for 2 standard deviations of difference, and bada bing, if you had 2 standard deviations of difference, they qualified for SLD. Well, that ended up in due process in several states, and what was concluded was that those test scores alone are not sufficient to determine whether or not a student has SLD. They did not have adequate reliability or validity. So what was decided was you can use those test scores, but you also, down here at the bottom, must use multiple sources of data and information. Well, what are multiple sources of data and information? Whoops. Multiple sources of data and information essentially are MTSS process sprinkled on top of your test scores. So what you're going to want to do is, and this is what everybody's been doing for the past several years, is get your test scores, and then do some scientifically based interventions. Do that over a period of time, collect your data, and then use those data to see if you think that the student has a specific learning disability or not. And everybody's been doing this, it's been fine. We haven't had any non-compliances related to that. So what you're doing out there, keep on doing it. It's like I said, we've had no non-compliances on that. So that's working well. Any questions on using patterns of strengths and weaknesses? Okay, moving along. Let's see, exclusionary factors. If there are circumstances that indicate that the disability or the deficiencies are not due to something, then you check those. If you don't check a box, then the student cannot be determined as having SLD. And here again, this is the same thing you've been doing on the form for the past several years. We good on that? Okay. As far as documentation of underachievement not due to lack of appropriate instruction, we want to make sure that the student has been provided appropriate instruction, and you need to show some history or talk about some documentation of assessments that have been done, what's been provided during MTSS or RTI, and be able to show that yes, this student was in fact provided appropriate instruction, and that what we're seeing here, the deficiencies that we're seeing, are not due to poor instruction. Simple as that. As far as the observations go, you guys are doing a good job with observations. Bottom line is, you need to do observations that relate to the disability or the suspected disability that you're looking at. You want most observations to be in the regular classroom setting, if at all possible, and if not, try to get observations in an environment that's as close as possible to what they would be in. They were in the school setting. One thing that we used to do is we used to use observations that have been done prior. What with the difficult, for instance, we used to write behavior incident reports, kids with behavior problems, and we would often refer back to the descriptions of what occurred in those incident reports, and that worked pretty well in some circumstances. The difficulty you run into with that, with OEC, is they'll want to know if you had consent to do those observations from the parent. And we didn't always have consent prior, and they have a little heartburn with that. So keep in mind, if you're going to do a formal observation, make sure you get the consent for that. That's the important piece there. Okay, we good on that one?
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
There was a question, if you could address, and I'm going to pronounce it as well as I can. I apologize if I butcher it. Layla?
Yeah, it's Leela.
Leela, I'm sorry. If you could come on and you said, could you address attendance in regards to this section, just specifically what section you're talking about?
Yeah, just real quick, I don't want to take up a lot of time. It's when you were talking about receiving the instructional implications, and you can't move forward with an SLD disability category if the student hasn't received appropriate instruction.
Yeah.
And what we've been finding, since the pandemic specifically, is that we have attendance issues and we get referrals, but the student has missed a lot of days. So did you have any pointers for that you could send to me, or just say online?
I can tell you what the ODE answer is, and then we can talk about it. The ODE answer is it's a team decision. And the question that are often posed is, why did the absences occur to begin with? That's the first question. If it's the pandemic and it's medical reasons, that's one circumstance. But if they really did miss such a substantial amount of instruction that they just didn't get the basic content they needed, that's not a disability. And then the question would become, how do you address that? And there was, my wife's a speech pathologist, and she had a family of kids a few years ago where they decided to do home instruction, and they did home instruction for like 3 years. And the kids showed up at school one day and said, "This isn't working so good. We want you guys to educate our student or our kids." And so they started doing some evaluations on the kids, and the kids looked just like, kids that were delayed. But what had really happened was they watched Captain Kangaroo and Sesame Street instead of learning anything. And they were delayed, in fact, but it wasn't because of a disability, it was because of lack of instruction. So if it really is lack of instruction, you should not qualify them as a student with disability, but you might use the same instructional strategies with those students as you use with other kids that do have disabilities. So, it's your team is going to have to decide how you will proceed as to whether you can really qualify those kids or not. But if they've really missed so much, then no, they shouldn't qualify. And we can talk about that more. If you want to talk specifics afterwards, when we get together, we can talk about that as well. Okay. Okay.
There's also a question Melinda asked, what about homeschool and intervention?
Homeschool, home instruction?
I'm not sure. Melinda, if you could jump on and just clarify what your question is, because I'm kind of confused as well.
Now, my question, you kind of talked about it a little bit there, is we have a lot of homeschool parents, not home instruction, but homeschool parents who are requesting evaluations, and usually for the entire family. And, documenting that they had any curriculum, let alone any interventions. And, using that as a determination, because you can also not, if you do the evaluation or you determine that we don't have that information, so you're not evaluating it, just how suggestions on navigating that piece. You talked about it a little bit there, Greg, at the end of that last statement.
It's there. Like I said, the official answer is it's a team decision, and what you guys probably need to talk. Well, I would go back and what they did with this family my wife had was they did a bunch of academic assessments. They also went back and did some intellectual assessments to the kids just to rule out some stuff. And academically they were pretty far behind, but the team concluded that they have missed so much instructional time in their life that they were delayed, but they weren't delayed because of a disability. So there again, you guys are you may want to do some of the same assessments that you would do in determining disability. Then maybe those kids do have disabilities. That's the other hard part that you try to ferret out in that process. And you're going to have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and see what in the world what your team decides is how you're going to proceed. That's about the best I can do. Anything else, Melinda?
Nope, you got it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, observations, we talked about that. Moving along, medical findings, we talked previously. I don't know why they have medical on there twice, but they do. Medical information, you've got it in part 2. Just want to summarize. what I suggest you do is, they say, well, you don't have to put this information in there with part one. The important thing to remember about part two is if it's stuff that you really want the IEP team to focus on, put it in the part two. And if you've got medical stuff that is critical, it's going to affect FAPE, put it in the part two. When it comes to your eligibility determination, we've got our 3 questions on this page, and these are the same they've been for the last 100 years. First question is, the poor performance is not due to lack of appropriate instruction. It's not due to that. The second question is, the child meets the state criteria for having a, do they meet the definition? And then the third question is, the child has an educational need that does require specially designed instruction. Bottom line is, if you answer no to any one of those questions, the student is not eligible for special ed. You must answer yes to all 3 questions for the student to be eligible. Okay? There again, we've been in now, these are the same questions we've had for quite some time. As far as the basis for eligibility determination, we want to know what some people do in this section is they'll cut and paste the definition out of the operating standards, and just that's the only thing they put in there. Don't do that. That will be a non-compliance. You can put the eligibility definition in there, but then you need to elaborate on how the assessment that were completed determined whether the student qualifies or not for special ed services. So you're going to want to, yes, address what the criteria are, but number B, and more importantly, make sure that you talk about the assessment results and how that student does or does not meet the eligibility criteria. We good on that? And like I said, we haven't had any difficulty with this. The only time that has been brought to our attention is just when it's the definition cut and paste out of the operating standards. Typically, if you put in there an explanation of assessment results, you're good to go. We good on that one? Okay. We already talked about that. We already talked about the required team members. Remember, if you have an SLD assessment, you have to have somebody that can administer assessments. The other interesting thing is in the operating standards on the initial evaluation, you'll notice that there's no intervention specialist listed there. Best practice by far is I would have an intervention specialist involved. I would want to have that expertise looking at the MTSS, RTI kind of stuff, have that available to the team. But by operating standards, don't need to do it. You must have your intervention specialist over here, of course. Okay, we good on that one? Nothing new there. And then the eligibility category. Why they did not do a drop-down, pull-down menu, I'll never know. But what you want to know is which category is the student eligible for, if in fact they're eligible. And write in one category. And it's got to be one of the official categories. Attention deficit disorder is not a disability category. It's got to be the ones that are federally defined. We good on that? Okay. We already talked about that. Preschool. If you had developmental delay identified, you have to make another choice. So the team's going to have to consider what disability category is most appropriate. Nothing new there. Anything you want to add to that, Aaron?
No, not at this time.
Okay. I wish they would have extended that developmental delay category up a few more years, but they didn't. So this is what we're dealing with. And then we have the signature page. On the signature page, you know, we've got our names, our titles, we've got drop down, whoops, drop down, they don't work there. We got signatures and dates. And then we also have on that whether you agree or disagree. For God's sakes, make sure your team agrees before you get in the room. Disagreements rarely occur, but they do occur. If somebody does disagree, and we're not including the parent here, the parent's got a whole litany of things they can do legally if they disagree, but if a staff member or a related services person or another team member disagrees, then they need to put a statement down in the ETR explaining why. And then these dates and all that stuff, these are just replications of what you've got on the cover page. We want to remind folks that you shouldn't actually vote on stuff. Eligibility determined by team consensus. And if the team can't come to consensus, your district representative makes the call. Like I said, for God's sakes, try to get those things ironed out before you get in there. You don't want this turning into a complaint or due process if you can avoid that at all costs. And I said you have to check the disagree, they must complete the statement. Any questions about what we talked about? Pretty riveting stuff, isn't it? Well, hopefully this was a review. People often ask, well, what comes now? And there is a what comes now. In the past couple years, we have been helping people set up internal monitoring processes. And essentially what we're doing is we're taking the ODE or the OEC monitoring guide and helping districts figure out, in community schools, figure out ways they can use that guide to evaluate their own ETRs and IEPs before any complaints are filed, before they get chosen for monitoring. It's a way to kind of take your temperature on how things are going and then help you stay on track. So we suggest, and this is the current monitoring guide for 22-23, we suggest you download that, and there's checklists in there. They're very nice checklists that OEC gives you an item that they're going to evaluate you on. And then they actually list the documents and places that they're going to look for that evidence. So it's a very nice way to kind of take the test before OEC ever shows up on your doorstep. What this does is this keeps you compliant, and it also keeps you headed down the quality pathway to making your ETRs and IEPs quality documents, as well as compliance documents. So that's the next step, is to look at that stuff. If you would like to talk with us about the different, there's no right or wrong way to do that. There's there's formal and informal ways, and there's district level and school level. There's a number of different variations on how we can do that. So if you're interested in learning more about internal monitoring, get with one of us, pop us an email, and we'd be glad to talk to you about it.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah,
there's a couple comments that link is not working, so I'm trying
This
to find
one?
the right link.
This
And
one?
also, there was a question
Oh.
regarding ETRs.
Yes.
Regarding reevals, requirements for kids that stay in preschool for a third year and were initially qualified under developmentally delayed category at age 3. If the child turns 6 in December of that option year, even if the ETR isn't due till May, do you have to have the RETR completed and the child qualify under a school age category by their 6th birthday?
Yes, it needs to be done by their 6th birthday, even if they're in preschool.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, that link, I just checked that link. That seems to be something on ODE's end. So we apologize for that.
Yeah, we'll get, I'll tell you what, we'll
Once we get that monitoring guide, we'll put it in that resource folder.
yes, that's what we'll do. That worked the other day when we did it.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I just went to ODE's site and that link is broken directly off their site. So I don't think it's our link, it is their link.
Okay. Very good. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is ETR in a 2.5-hour presentation. If you have questions that come up, as unique circumstances come up regarding evaluations and IEPs, that's what we're here for. Feel free to contact us. And I guess we'll see you guys back at 1 o'clock for the IEP session. We done,
Thank
Steve?
you.
Yeah, I'm just looking to make sure we got all the questions.
Yeah.
Greg, will you advance to the next slide that has all of our email addresses on it?
There.
Hey, Tina, if you have any questions specifically about transfer ETRs, please reach out. There's just so many nuances. We didn't want to put any answers in the chat box that may not apply to all situations. So most of those questions were handled in private chats, but if you have like a specific situation or question, please email one of us, or if you wanted to hop on now and ask.
It's a general question. It was just about if we receive a transfer ETR from another district within Ohio, but it doesn't meet compliance guidance and we don't want to accept it, would we complete an initial evaluation for that student, or would we complete a reevaluation for that student?
Yeah, that would become a reevaluation.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I've worked in a couple of different districts and they have handled it in different ways. Like one district was, if it's from in-state and you didn't accept it, it was a reeval. But if it was from another in-state, but you didn't accept it, it was an initial.
I don't see how it could. I don't see how it would ever pass through EMIS reporting as an initial, because it would red flag that the student had previously had been identified. Even if the time, like the 3-year time limits run up, and you do, 6 years later after the 3-year time limit runs up, and they come back, EMIS would flag that, showing that that student had already been in the system. It wouldn't even I don't even think it would let you put it in as an initial evaluation.
If there was ever a case where it would go through, like, would there have ever been a time when there was guidance otherwise about that? Because I just want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. And I want to make, because I've had 2 different experiences, I just want to make sure that the one that I'm working through is.
I don't see any instance where it would ever, where not, at least in my time in the last 10 years, has that ever been guidance that would be an initial evaluation? No.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. See, the thing is what's going to happen is you're going to go in and that student's going to be identified already as a student with a disability, and it's the initial won't enter.
The only time I would see it maybe happening is if that previous district did not find that student eligible. And
Yeah,
if that's the case, then it would become an initial eval because they were no longer eligible for services.
They would have been coded back as gen ed
Correct.
at some point. Yeah.
Okay, so if it's student qualifies in Ohio, but there's compliance concerns with the evaluation we receive, we can reject it and just complete a reevaluation. Is there a timeline on that? If we reject it, or do we just serve the transfer IEP the best we can until we can complete that new reevaluation?
Yeah.
You serve the transfer IEP, but then you still have your your timelines just to complete it within a reasonable
Okay.
amount of time.
All right, thank you.
And in the meantime, you have to provide comparable services based on the information that you are provided with.
Yeah.
And you cannot use the evaluation time to delay. Or
Right.
to
Oh
provide
yeah,
a
we would
reason.
serve the IEP comparably
Right.
as best we could.
Correct.
Melinda, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks. The other question, we get some districts that when we receive a student in and they send us the last IEP, the student, might have bounced around from different districts. And so one district has adopted someone else's ETR and they redo a front cover page. And then it starts to become, they've changed the end date of the, the reevaluation date that's determined. So can you kind of talk about for those when you're when you have someone moving in and you choose to adopt that ETR to transfer it in, we should not be doing a new cover page because it should not change any dates, correct? Is it really more of an EMIS and a documentation piece that you're adopting it rather than that? And lots of people do it differently. Just want to make sure that we're meeting what that expectation is.
When people create a new cover page, I hear all kinds of nightmare stories about it being entered by admin professionals or secretaries into the system incorrectly and then red flagging it in EMIS. I would stay away from a new cover page. The PRO1 that you would submit, send to the parent would then cover that, what should include that information. And that kind of goes to Jill Tucker asked a question about where do they include that they've had another ETR, and you can include that information in the profile, but I wouldn't ever mix ETRs on the same cover page.
Yeah, and we've had that issue. So they've moved in and the district they came from had done a new cover page. They put a cover page over the original ETR, and then our ISs get confused and then they miss a compliance date because they went by the dates that the district put on for that new cover page, and it just becomes a nightmare. So I just wanted to make sure, because we were not doing that cover page, we just wanted to make sure that there wasn't something we were missing.
Yeah, I would stay away from creating a whole new cover page, to be honest. But again, once, like Greg said, that's one of those district procedures that doesn't really fall under compliant or non-compliant and is kind of hard for us to speak to, other than giving our best, advice to avoid non-compliant.
Yeah, and I think that could also be district by district and what platform you're using. Like, I know the district I just left, if we didn't put something on a cover page, it would not push the data into EMIS.
Yeah.
And that was the system we were using. The system I had the year before, that wasn't the case. So you'd really have to look at your system and how that talks, and talk with your EMIS coordinator and how all of those systems integrate.
And we manually enter all of that information. We do not have it automatically populate. So for us, it's that
Okay.
wouldn't be an issue for us. So, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We done, guys?
I'm just trying
Are
to.
you still looking for questions?
Yeah, we had at one point we had like 130 people on here, and the questions were just firing in.
Yeah, I was trying to write them all down and then they were coming too fast. So
I think that's it. If there's a question, if somebody's on here and we've missed a question, please chime in. I apologize. We'll do our best to answer that.
Hey there, somebody earlier asked a really good question about if the team brings up another category that was not suspected in the planning form, do you need to amend the planning form to include that category during the eligibility discussion?
You should, yeah.
So then do you need to go through all that like consent again, but also like the evaluation was already completed, like it's all just kind of weird? Or do you just kind of add it in that suspected categories area and say was discussed during meeting or something?
I would not put it, I would not go back and change the planning form. You could, in the PRO1, you could say that questions arose about another disability category and you discussed it. But to officially assess for it, you'd have to go back and do that.
Like I think
over again.
we're thinking like between like SLD and OHI, like those kinds of things. Like
Yeah.
the kid could be SLD and they could also be OHI for like ADHD. And that's where like, I know I always usually try and cover my bases on the planning form. Like if it's even like a thought, like I'll put both there so this doesn't happen. But like sometimes it does just come up and we talk about it. And I guess I just want to make sure that, it's in compliance. So, in those cases, I don't know, I have been just because I've told that it's, and I put it on the planning form because I've been told that both of those areas need to be discussed if they're OHI, but the planning form says SLD, that's wrong. So that's where like I will go back and then put it there written so it's clear that it was different, and then put it in the PRO1 saying that it wasn't suspected previously, but whatever, we still have all of the data in the ETR to support either category. It's just like sometimes it, it wasn't suspected. I don't know.
Just
It's all
document
random case by case thing.
what you do with the discussion.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Well, make sure you document how things occurred. If you get into a place where you're in mid-evaluation and somebody says, I think we got something else, I would go back and amend things. If it's just a discussion that comes up in the eligibility determination meeting, you could just describe that as, questions arose and the conversation occurred.
On the preschool planning form, under that box, under the column of part C, do you say, like, what do you put there? Do you put who, like the person who will be reviewing that information?
If they're coming from like Help Me Grow, you mean? It
Right.
would be the person, yeah, it would be the person reviewing.
So if I'm reviewing that part stuff in my section 1, it like school psychologists will be listed in that category.
So if the school psychologist is the one who collected the information, who talked with Help Me Grow, who met with parents regards to Help Me Grow, then it would be that person, whoever completed that section, not necessarily the one who's going to be presenting on it.
Okay.
So it could be a coordinator, it could be the psychologist, it could be a therapist, it just depends.
Okay. But either way, like I've seen it, some people put like part C there, like in that whole column, but it should list the person who is collecting that information.
Correct.
Okay. And then it would be, just to go on with that question there, it would be an initial ETR and like, I don't know. I was just trying to read, they asked that, I didn't know.
I'm confused by what that question is asking.
Yeah, I know. So as I read it, I was like, wait, what?
If Fanning is still on, if you want to hop on and kind of explain that, I'd be happy to answer it.
Oops, sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So on there, you have the option to check, like there's 3 options. You can check transition for Part C, initial, or reevaluation. So I know technically it's considered an initial evaluation, but it's also considered a transition from Part C. Do we check both?
I'm not sure exactly where you're talking about. I don't have that
Okay,
planning
sorry.
form up in front of me. Sorry.
On the planning, on the preschool planning form. It is, hold on.
I'm trying to pull it up on my computer.
Yeah, underneath the spot where it says date of plan, you can check if it's an initial, a reevaluation, or a transition from Part C.
Yeah. Next to data plan.
I will get back to you on that one. So my form that I used with the program for the district I was in, we would always mark that initial evaluation. So let me double check that.
Okay.
And then we will message that out to everyone.
Okay, yeah, because then it allows you, like I know on Sample at least, it allows you to check both because technically it is considered a
Right.
transition from Part C, but it's also considered an initial. So I've always checked both boxes, but I just wanted to make sure that I just didn't need to do transition from Part C only.
I'm wondering if, and again, it might be a whatever program you're using. I know the program we used, we had to add the transition planning conference date, and then that transferred over to EMIS. So that might be what this form does, or that box does. So let me double check, and then we will get back to you on that.
Okay, awesome.
And the transition planning date is like served as like a date of referral, correct?
Yes and no. That's a very tricky one. I'll find the exact wording on that. Your date of referral is actually the date that the Part C sends you information about the student. And then there's a specific form that they have to fill out and they send you that form. That is your date of referral. But then your date of your conference may be different.
Okay.
Preschool is very confusing. So I
That's
understand.
kind of what I guess I'm kind of concerned with that too, because like that's why I just got a transfer, you know, from like it was okay. So we got all of her information like a month before the actual meeting happened. So before the actual meeting happened, we should be signing consent and everything then.
You would have 30 days to say whether or not you're going to evaluate. Yes.
Oh my God.
Let me, Kiera, what I'll do, I don't know if you're a part of the preschool supervisor network or if your director or preschool coordinator is a part of that supervisor network. A lot of this information is shared during those meetings.
Okay.
So I will send you information about that network, and that way you or someone within your district would be able to hop onto those.
Okay.
But don't feel like you're the only one confused on this. Every time we have these meetings, there's a lot of questions about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Greg, earlier today you mentioned the DD bill. Was that the Senate Bill 356 that did not pass?
On which piece?
Extending DD.
Oh, no, that was something else. That was, yeah, that was long ago.
There is still discussion on that. So they have not ruled anything out just yet.
Okay.
Last I heard, they were hoping by the end of the school year, if not sooner, to make that determination. But we at SST-11 will make sure that we push that information out as soon as we get confirmation.
Awesome.
So as of right now, DD does not transfer over to school age.
What are you predicting? Do you think they're going to make that change in Ohio to extend it into school age services, or do you think it's still going to be the same?
Who knows? I mean, I
Give
don't
me
want to
some
say,
hope. Give
I
me
don't want
some
to say
hope.
one way or the other, just because I honestly, you never know with things like this.
Okay, thank
A
you.
lot of states carry it over until age 8. Some go to age 10. So it ultimately just comes down to what the state of Ohio determines is best practice.
Okay. Thank you. I started off in South Carolina and we had it through, you know, not just in preschool, but for early elementary as well. And it was so helpful to adequately identify students and give them that extra time to make that growth. So it's been challenging in a lot of cases in Ohio, just because they don't have that much time to really, you know, show growth. But thank you for any updates.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. So hopefully we'll get those answers soon.
Thanks.
All right. If there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and close the meeting and stop the recording. If anything comes up, by all means, please reach out to one of the 4 of us, and we will do our best to get you the correct answer. Thank you again for attending this morning, and I'm sure we will see most of you guys this afternoon at 1 o'clock for the IEP portion of today's training.